Okay, so shortly I want to get to this idea of diagramming arguments to really tell us more about argument structure. But before we do, I think we should take just a short detour and talk about this distinction between deductive and inductive arguments that your book presents in Chapter 1. And we'll say a lot more about this. I mean, this will come up over and over and over again in the course. I just want to take a first pass at this in this lecture and the next, and some related concepts, especially this concept of validity. So just a sort of introduction to these ideas. So arguments are generally divided into two types, deductive and inductive. Now there's a little bit of debate on this issue. Your book talks about another kind of argument, abductive arguments. Some philosophers and logicians will argue that there's even more than that. Some people will talk about conductive arguments. We're not going to talk about either of those types. There's some debate on this issue, but I think more importantly for our purposes, most of the really useful stuff with argument analysis, with determining whether arguments are good or not, the deductive-inductive distinction will be enough. So I want to take a really practical approach in this class, just basically ask, well, is this useful for our purposes? And I think even if these other kinds of arguments exist, the more fine distinction really isn't going to be useful for us, so we'll stick with deductive and inductive. Well, so what does this distinction mean? So the main difference between inductive and deductive arguments are how the premises support the conclusion and what kind of support they're supposed to provide for the conclusion. So a deductive argument, if the structure of the argument is good, and I know talking about the structure of an argument being good is incredibly vague and not really the kind of thing you want to hear in logic, but we'll stick with that for now. If the structure is good or valid, and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. If a deductive argument has a good structure, a valid structure, and we'll talk more about what this term valid means in a minute, as we use it in philosophy, it's a bit of jargon. It means a little something different than what it means in normal language. But anyway, if a deductive argument is valid, if the structure is good, then we cannot even imagine a way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false. A valid structure in a deductive argument makes it impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. An inductive argument, on the other hand, if the structure is good, and we'll talk more about what that means as we go through the course, but if the structure is good and the premise is true, then the conclusion is likely true. No matter how good an inductive argument might be, there's always some chance that the conclusion is false. Now look, we don't want to magnify this, right? I mean, in some cases, that chance might be 0.000001%. It might be very, very, very small, but there is some chance here. So here's an example of a deductive argument. To legally become president of the U.S., one must be a natural-born citizen. That is, you have to have been born in the U.S. or have one parent or both who were citizens. Arnold Schwarzenegger is not a natural-born citizen. He was a naturalized citizen. He was born in Austria. His parents were Austrian. He became a citizen later. So Arnold Schwarzenegger cannot legally become president of the U.S. If these premises are true, if it is a legal requirement that you have to be a natural-born citizen and Schwarzenegger isn't, then there's no possible way we can imagine that he could legally become president of the U.S. As long as these premises are true, it is impossible for him to legally be president. Now look, if this changed, if suddenly one of the premises were false, if two were false, if we change the Constitution, then maybe he could become president. But as long as these two premises, 1 and 2, are true, which at the present moment they are, 3 has to be true as well. So here is an inductive argument. A man has won the electoral vote in every single U.S. presidential election so far. So the winner of the electoral vote in 2024 will probably be a man. I don't know how good an inductive argument this is. It might be a bad one. It might be a better one. I don't know. But the point is, the premise provides some support for the conclusion, but it doesn't make the conclusion a sure thing, right? Even if something's happened a bunch of times in the past, doesn't mean it'll necessarily happen again in the future, right? We'll talk more about other kinds of inductive arguments. This is just a sort of very simple example. We'll talk about deductive arguments being valid. Valid is a sort of either or, all or nothing thing. We'll talk a bit more about what we mean by validity in the next lecture. Your book introduces this jargon for inductive arguments, cogent. A cogent deductive argument is where premises provide strong support for the conclusion, and the premises are true, or have a very high probability of being true. Strictly speaking, in inductive logic, we'll talk about the probability the premises are true and not just simply about them being true. I just bring this up here in passing to say I really don't care about this jargon. Inductive arguments. Deductive, there's this neat all or nothing validity concept, which we will talk about in the next lecture. Inductive arguments, it's more complicated. Strictly speaking, we'll just talk about a probability of whether the conclusion's true given the premises are true, or the probability the premises are true. So I really don't like this cogent distinction because it's kind of subjective. If we're being precise, we'll talk more about the probabilities. We'll get to that at the end of the semester. I'm not going to use this jargon. Just know it's out there if you take future classes in logic or whatever. Your book mentions it. I'm going to bring it up, and we're just going to promptly leave this aside. All right, one final thing I'll talk about. You should just develop an ability to see whether something's inductive or deductive, but I think it does help to see where you're likely to see these kinds of arguments. Arguments in mathematics, arguments applying definitions or moral or legal principles are usually deductive, right? The Schwarzenegger argument I gave you guys, it's applying a legal principle, it's a deductive argument. Arguments in the sciences are usually inductive, right? We've given this drug to 10,000 people, only one person had a bad side effect, so you probably won't have a bad side effect if you take it, right? Very common in medical research. Arguments about probabilities or likelihood are almost always inductive. If I talk about the probability that you'll lose money playing craps, I forget what it is, but it's pretty good. If I talk about that, that's an inductive argument. Anyway, just keep that in mind. I think, as we see more of these, I think you guys will just get better figuring out what we're talking about. But that's, I think, a handy sort of just first pass about when you should look for what kind, maybe a little bit of a hint.